Now this entire unit we've been doing nothing but solving quadratic equations or quadratic functions, right? We had several ways to do that. One was by factoring, and others by completing the squares, so on and so forth. Well, today what we're going to use is what's called the quadratic formula. But just to clarify and make sure that we're keeping things straight here, do you remember the difference between a quadratic function and a quadratic equation? Well, you graph the function y is equal to ax squared plus bx plus c, but we'll solve quadratic equations ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where all we've done is just plug in 0 for y. That means that's what we do when we make a quadratic function a quadratic equation. Just substitute 0 in for y. But regardless, it's all about what? When you have a quadratic, that means you're going to have a parabola. And what we want to know is when we're graphing a parabola is when we're solving it, where does the graph cross the x-axis? Where does the x-axis meet the graph, the actual curve? So when we know this point and this point, we have solved that particular quadratic. Or it might look something like this. And I want to know where it touches the x-axis. Or it may be even only touching it once, like that. And I'll want to know what that point is. Or maybe it doesn't even touch at all, in which case we would have no solution because we want to know where it's touching the x-axis. Or something like this. It could be even something real shallow like this, and it still only touches one place. But anyway, well, that's what we're wanting to know is where does the actual curve, the parabola, touch the x-axis? That's what we're going for when we're asked to find the solution to find the roots of a quadratic is where is it meeting the x-axis. All right, so now that maybe we've clarified some things there, the thing about the quadratic formula is you will always be able to find an answer. Now, if you recall, sometimes when you were solving by factoring, they weren't factorable, were they? And therefore, we would not be able to come up with our answers. So sometimes if they're not factorable, we can get into a little bit of trouble here. But with a quadratic formula, you're always going to have an answer. Now, that being said, all answers, when using your quadratic formula, if it doesn't come out to be a rational number, if we don't get our two round numbers like 8 and 2 or 7 and -5 or whatever, if it comes out to be irrational, I want to have the simplified radical, and I want you to round it to the nearest tenth. Now I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in just a few minutes. But let's just take a simple one here, number 1, and let's figure out what the solutions are to solve this particular quadratic. And when we do that, we want to write down what A is, B is equal to 8, C is equal to 12, and now I always write down the formula first. X is equal to, and I would put B in parentheses because we're going to get jammed here. If you don't, I guarantee it. So put B in parentheses. You got negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all of it over 2A. So all we're going to do is plug the numbers into the formula and just simply do the math. So X equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all of it over 2A. And now I'm going to plug in my numbers. Let's do this. All right, so B is equal to 8. So I'm going to put an 8 in this parentheses and an 8 in parentheses, and I'm going to square it. Minus 4 times A is equal to 1, C is equal to 12, and again, A is equal to 1 here. So we'll have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 12 over 2 times 1. And now just do the math. We'll have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times 1 times 12 is 48. All of that over 2. And I'll have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. Now at this point, as soon as you have that radical simplified, we're going to need two answers here because we have the plus and minus in front of that radical. Remember that when you take the square root of a number, you're getting two answers, the positive value and the negative value. We've talked about that earlier. So here's what I want you to do. We need to write down two different answers. We have negative 8 plus, now what's the square root of 16? 4 over 2. And then we also have negative 8. We're going to do the minus 4 over 2. So we've broken it up into our two answers, negative 8 plus 4 over 2 and negative 8 minus 4 over 2. All right, so now we just do the math for this one. Negative 8 plus 4 is negative 4 over 2 is negative 2. And negative 8 minus 4 is negative 12 over 2 is negative 6. So our two answers, this particular parabola crosses the x-axis at two different places, at negative 2 and negative 6. Number 2. Write down what A, B, and C are. A is equal to 3, B is equal to 11, and C is equal to negative 4. So x equals, I'm going to put B in parentheses, so negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. I'm telling you, you're going to want to write the formula down first. Always get used to the formulas, and then always put your that B in parentheses. 1, because you have a negative here, and 2, because you're squaring it. I guarantee you, you will want to put those things in parentheses. All right, so we'll have negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 4. All of it over 2 times 3. Negative 11 plus or minus the square root of, well, 11 squared is 121, minus 4 times 3 times negative 4. See that double negative there? That's going to give us a plus. 4 times 3 is 12 times 4 is 48 over 2 times 3 is 6. Negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 169 over 6. Two different answers now. What's the square root of 169? 13, right? So we're going to have negative 11 plus 13 over 6 and negative 11 minus 13 over 6. Write out your two different numbers here. Negative 11 plus 13 is 2 over 6 is 1/3. And negative 11 minus 13 is negative 24 over 6. Which is negative 4. So our two answers here are 1/3 and negative 4. Now that's not the point 1/3 and negative 4. This parabola crosses the x-axis at 1/3 and negative 4. Number 3. Let's keep track of what A is. B is negative 6. C is negative 10. X equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. I would write out the formula every single time. 1, it gets you to remembering, planning into your long-term memory what the formula is. And then also it gets you used to using formulas correctly. Now notice b is -6. So we have the negative on the outside, and this is where things can get jammed up if you're not careful. There's the negative that's outside the parentheses, and the -6 goes inside the parentheses, plus or minus the square root of, and again, -6 squared minus 4 times 1 times -10, all over 2 times 1. Now that double -6 makes that a +6, plus or minus the square root of, now -6 squared, what do you get? If you're writing down -36, you need to be careful here, because you know that -6 squared is +36. You're going to have -4 times 1 times -10. That double negative here makes that +40 all over 2. All right, so here we're going to have to be a little bit careful about how we solve this problem. Depends on which calculator you have. Now, adding the 36 and the 40, you get 76. Well, here's what's going to happen. We're going to break this up into 6 plus radical 76 over 2 and 6 minus radical 76 over 2. Now, if you have this style of calculator, not a problem. I would go ahead and punch your fraction button here, and in the numerator we're going to have 6 plus radical 76. Move into the denominator, do 2, and it tells you what the answer is. Radical 19 plus 3 that's the simplified radical. What would that be as a decimal? Whoops, wrong button. Just hit this double arrow and that should give you, there we go, 7.4. So that's a point. So one of your answers would be radical 19 plus 3, and as a decimal it's 7.4. Your other would be 6 minus radical 76. So let's see what that would be. And I did it again. All right, so again, fraction bar. Let's do 6 minus radical 76. Move it into the denominator, divide by 2. We get negative radical 19 plus 3. And as a decimal, that would be, double arrow, negative 1.4. So as the simplified radicals, we're talking about radical 19 plus 3 and negative radical 19 plus 3. As decimals, we're looking at 7.4, negative 1.4. Otherwise, you're going to have to know how to simplify these radicals and simplify these fractions. And I'm not going to go into that right now. We'll talk about that in class. Number 4. What's the difference between number 4 and numbers 1, 2, and 3? We always have to start out with our equation equal to 0. So I'm going to have to start out by subtracting 3 from both sides. X squared plus 5x minus 3 is equal to 0. So now a is equal to 1, b is equal to 5, c is now equal to negative 3, not positive 3. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. B is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 4 times 1 times negative 3 all over 2 times 1. Negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus negative 12. So aren't we getting 37 there over 2? So the two simplified radical, because radical 37 does not simplify, you could keep this one written as this, negative 5 plus or minus radical 37 over 2. Nothing to simplify there. Radical 30, as far as the radical is concerned, radical 37 does not simplify. So we can keep your two answers in simplified radical form like this. And then we need to convert each of those into decimals rounded off to the nearest tenth. So let's take a look at how that would work. Negative 5 plus radical 37 over 2. Fraction bar first. Negative 5 plus radical 37 over 2. Oh, I did times there, didn't I? Let's try that again. Negative 5 plus radical 37 . Okay, here we go. All right. Fraction bar. Negative 5 plus radical 37, denominator 2 equals. There we go. So there's our simplified. There's another way to write it. Don't worry about that. Leave it the way you had it, but we have to change this to a decimal, and we get 0.5. Then we're going to do the negative 5 minus. So fraction bar, negative 5 minus radical 37 over 2. Decimal, negative 5.5. And that is how you use the quadratic formula. So on the next page, and I would recommend that you do this on a separate sheet of paper, give yourselves plenty of room to work these out. Do numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 on your own. And when you're done, go ahead and come back to the video and see how you're doing. But 5, 6, 7, and 8 on your own. If you want to try to do it right here on your notes, that obviously that's okay. But go ahead and pause the video right now and come back in when you're done with these 4 problems. All right, so here's number 5. What happened with this one? Well, look at what we have underneath the radical. After you do your b squared minus 4ac, you get 2 squared minus 4 times 3 times 5. 4 times 3 is 12, times 5 is 60. But what's 4 minus 60? Negative 56, right? Well, if you were to plug in negative 56 and try to take the square root of that in your calculator, it would come up no solution. So this particular parabola does not even touch the x-axis. There is no solution for this particular problem. In number 6, we have to add 2 to both sides first. So when you do that, you get x squared minus 3x plus 2. So a is equal to 1, b is equal to negative 3, and c is equal to positive 2. After plugging everything into your calculator and into the formula, you're going to get 3 plus radical 1 over 2, and then 3 minus radical 1 over 2. And then what's the square root of 1? It's 1, so you're going to have 3 plus 1 is 4 over 2 is 2, and then 3 minus 1 is 2 over 2. So you get this particular parabola crosses the x-axis at 2 different places at 2 and positive 1. Let's look at what happens in number 7. Something else happens here, something a little bit strange. When you plug everything into your calculator and into the formula, what do you get underneath the radical sign? Well, you get this 0 here, right? Well, that tells you that when there's a 0 underneath the radical, that tells you there's only going to be one answer, because when you take the square root of 0, then you're going to have negative 12 plus 0 over 8, then negative 12 minus 0 over 8. You actually come up with the same number both times, negative 3/2. So on this particular problem, it's just the vertex that lies on the x-axis at negative 1 1/2. And lastly, on number 8, when you plug everything into the formula, you get radical 20. So we're going to have negative 6 plus or minus radical 20 over 2. Simplifying, if you don't have the right kind of calculator to handle this, it could get a little bit messy. Now look what happens. What is the square root of 20? Simplify that radical. It's 2 radical 5. So I'm going to have negative 6 plus 2 radical 5 over 2, and then negative 6 minus 2 radical 5 over 2. See where we're getting that? Radical 20 is 2 radical 5. So I'm just plugging in the 2 radical 5 for both times the plus and the minus here. Okay? So what's going to happen here, and again, if you don't have the right kind of calculator, you're going to have to do this on your own. You see how there's a 2 that can be factored out of this? So I'm take out the 2 and I get negative 3 plus radical 5. Here's your 2 in the denominator. And this 2 is going to cancel out this 2. So we have negative 3 plus radical 5. That's one of your answers in simplified radical form. Your other one, again, same thing here. You have a 2 that's in common here. Factor out the 2, and you get negative 3 minus radical 5. These 2's cancel, and you get negative 3 minus the radical 5. Those are your 2 answers in simplified radical form. Taking a look at those, and if you were to plug those into your calculator and simplify those, round them off to the nearest tenth. Now, rounding those off to the nearest tenth, you get negative 0.8 and negative 5.2. Here are a bit more challenging problems on the last page, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What we're going to have to do is simplify each side of these, get 0 on one side before you can actually start in. If you want to give these a shot on your own, see what you can do with them. And you can pause the video and I'll be back to show you the answers momentarily. But keep this in mind. When you're solving a quadratic by graphing, well, it's not always accurate because if you get into fractions and so on, you're not going to know where those fractions are. Factoring can be quick if the polynomial can be factored easily, but again, not all of them can be factored. Completing the square, it's a little bit complicated. We're not even going over that so much in Algebra 1. Here's the thing though. The quadratic formula always works every single time. So if you're ever stuck and not able to, something happens on the graphing and you're not able to factor, then go ahead and use the quadratic formula. It will always work. So go ahead and pause the video. See if you can try these 4 problems up here on your own. If not, come back in a few minutes and I'll have the answers for you. All right, so, well, that's number 2. I want to go back to number 1. Here we go. What you're going to do is use the distributive property and come up with 2x squared plus 18x is equal to 2x minus 8. Now we have to get 0 on the right side. So we're going to subtract 2x from both sides to give us 16x, and then add 8 and get us plus 8. So a is equal to 2, b is equal to 16, c is equal to 8. Plugging everything in, you get negative 4 plus or minus 2 radical 3. And that gives us the 2 rounded off to the nearest tenth as negative 0.5 and negative 7.5. You can pause the video and write things down as you need. Let's go on to number 2. Here in number 2, again, we're going to have to use the distributive property and come up with x squared plus 3x, and subtracting 8x and subtracting the 7 in order to get 0, we get negative 5x minus 7. So a is equal to 1, b is equal to negative 5, c is equal to negative 7. We get 5 plus or minus radical 53 over 2, which are decimals 6.1 and negative 1.1. Again, pause your video and copy as you need. Number 3, we have to use FOIL on the left side to get rid of the parentheses there. We get 3y squared plus 10y minus 8 is equal to 0. You know, after we subtract the y and subtract the 14. When we FOIL it, we get 3y squared plus 11y plus 6. Subtract the y from both sides, you get 10y. Subtract 14, you get negative 8, so on and so forth. Again, pause the video and see what you can figure out, see how I'm coming up with these. And last but not least, again, number 4, we're going to have to FOIL the left side, get 4a squared minus 9a plus 2 is equal to 5a minus 3. After subtracting 5a from both sides and then adding 3 to both sides to get that 0, we get 4a squared minus 14a plus 5 is equal to 0. And we get 7 plus or minus radical 29 over 4. And then as the decimals, 3.1 and 0.4. And that, as they say, is a wrap. So good luck on your assignment, and we'll see you in class.